A poised black woman steps into the airport like any other traveler, but what happens next exposes a system no one was ready to confront. A flight attendant, driven by silent bias, tries to remove her from the boarding line without cause. He has no idea she's the FAA's chief regulator. And just minutes later, the truth comes crashing down and careers are changed forever. What follows sets off a powerful chain reaction that still echoes through the entire airline industry. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true accounts that reveal the truth behind the silence. It all started on what seemed like just another ordinary day at Gate B27. Airports are strange places, modern cathedrals where hope, exhaustion, and suspicion kneel side by side. And Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International, that great river of faces and machines, was no exception. Beneath its polished floors and bright-lit gates, the nation's conscience passed in plain clothes, pulling luggage behind it. It was just past dawn, and the day had already begun its march of indignities. Announcements crackled overhead with tired enthusiasm. Children whimpered. Security lines curled like smoke. The elderly leaned on canes. Soldiers in uniform looked too young for their burdens. And at Gate B27 she stood. Dr. Elise Morgan, not in a lab coat, not behind a podium, not as the FAA's chief regulator. No, she stood as a black woman in a tailored navy blazer, with a boarding pass in her hand and a silence in her eyes that only those who've been looked through can carry. She was early. Always was. The line had not yet formed, but people were already beginning to cluster near the gate, inching forward with that peculiar desperation that modern travel breeds, the fear of being forgotten, misplaced, left behind. Elise didn't jostle. She simply waited. To an untrained eye, she was just another traveler. But to Thomas Grayson, a flight attendant already on edge from too many delayed flights and too few hours of sleep, she became something else entirely. He saw her, not with the eyes of recognition, but with the eyes of a man who had been trained, quietly over years, to fear what he could not name. He would not have called it racism. No, men like him rarely do. He would have said it was protocol, that he was doing his job, that something felt off. But the truth is simpler. He saw a black woman standing with too much ease, a kind of composure that unsettled him. Not loud, not angry, just certain. And that certainty, to a man unsure of his own standing in the world, felt like a challenge. That's how it starts, you know. Not with slurs, but with suspicion. Not with laws, but with glances that linger too long and policies applied too loosely. Thomas adjusted his jacket, smoothed the front of his uniform. He was preparing, though he didn't yet know for what. All he knew was that he had noticed her. And in noticing her, he had decided, without evidence, without reason, that something needed confirming. She, on the other hand, had seen this before, had lived this before. The questions disguised as concern. The requests disguised as regulation. The tone shift. The delay. It hadn't happened yet, but she felt it. That subtle shift in the room when a black woman becomes the focus of unspoken doubt. She adjusted the strap of her tote and glanced around. The gate agent fumbled with a monitor. A child dropped a juice box. The plane had not yet arrived, but the story already had. She did not know the man watching her, but she knew the story he would try to write her into. And that is how we begin, not with drama, but with a question that should never have been asked. Why is she standing so calmly? There are mornings in America when the sun rises without warmth, when light itself feels like interrogation. At Gate B27, the delay had begun to settle into the crowd like dust. People fidgeted. Gate agents whispered behind counters. The loudspeakers delivered their apologies with mechanical cheer. But for Thomas Grayson, the flight attendant whose uniform had come to feel like both armor and permission, it was not the delay that agitated him. It was her. Dr. Elise Morgan still stood quietly among the crowd, unbothered, scrolling her phone. Not pacing. Not complaining. Not asking questions. And that, to Thomas, became the question. Because you see, in a country like this, a black woman is never just waiting. She is always being measured. Measured by how loudly she speaks. Measured by how silently she endures. Measured by how she walks, by how she sits, by whether or not she smiles. And Elise Morgan? She wasn't playing the game. That unnerved him. She had become a presence, too still to ignore. Not loud, but seen. And to men like Thomas, trained in 1,000 silent ways to interpret calmness as challenge, that was enough. He adjusted his posture, began making rounds through the gate area, asking passengers if they needed anything. But each step brought him back, mentally, to her. Why is she so calm? Why hasn't she asked for help? Why does she carry herself like someone who belongs? The questions echoed louder than the flight delay announcement. Thomas didn't know her name, didn't know her title. All he knew was how she made him feel. And that feeling, uncomfortable and shapeless, clawed at his chest like a warning. This wasn't protocol. This was a projection. He began crafting a story in his head, one where she was filming, investigating, maybe preparing to file a complaint. Why else would she be so composed? That's the trick of racial bias. It doesn't need evidence. It only needs imagination. And Thomas, though unaware of the history behind his suspicion, had stepped right into its lineage. Meanwhile, Elise Morgan had noticed. She had noticed the glances that lasted too long. The conversations near the counter that quieted when she walked by. She had felt the temperature of the room change, not literally, but in the way black people feel heat before there's fire. She had experienced this enough times to recognize the signs. The way a uniformed white man with just enough power could turn curiosity into authority. But she said nothing, because dignity, for her, had always meant resisting the urge to explain herself to those who'd already made up their minds. Instead, she waited. The irony, of course, was that Elise Morgan was not just another traveler. She had read safety protocols cover to cover, had written portions of them, had trained men like Thomas to spot risk, real risk, not just the ghosts that live in their assumptions. She did not yet know that her name would soon be whispered behind closed doors in airline offices. Within hours, Thomas's suspicion would become his undoing. All she knew was that once again, she was being watched. Not for what she had done, but for what she wasn't doing. And in that quiet judgment lay the deeper truth of America's racial absurdity. The black woman who waits silently is as dangerous as the one who shouts. Because both defy the roles they've been assigned. Elise straightened her back. She had not come to fight. But she would not fold. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the clouds were gathering. It was just after 9 a.m., and the announcement came like the breaking of a wave. Flight 237 to Denver is now beginning the boarding process. Please line up according to your zone. The crowd, restless and worn, surged into motion. And with it came a familiar disorder, children fussing, headphones pulled on, overpacked bags rolled over the heels of strangers. But none of that mattered. Not to him. Because Thomas Grayson, flight attendant, still had her on his mind. Dr. Elise Morgan had moved to the front of the boarding line with quiet precision, her ticket and ID in hand, her expression unreadable. And Thomas, despite every visible sign of normalcy, despite the fact that her name was on the manifest, despite the fact that she had said not a single provocative word all morning, felt something. Not dangerous. Not logic. Just that haunting, invisible sense that she was too composed. That she didn't flinch when she looked at him. That her very presence refused to bend. And, to a man who had learned, somewhere deep inside, that authority only functions when it is recognized, this was unbearable. He waved through a few passengers, making light banter with a young father and helping an older man adjust his mask. But when Elise stepped forward, time slowed. "Ma'am," he said, voice lined with that false softness that always precedes control. "May I see your boarding pass?" She handed it over. Her ID followed. He stared longer than necessary. "Compare the names again." Looked at her, then back at the ID. Elise, as always, remained still. And then, with a tone that suggested nothing but carried everything, he said, "I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment. Now, for the older folks in this country, those who've lived long enough to remember bus terminals and lunch counters, this moment will ring familiar. Because it is never about the past. It is never about the ID. It is about the pause, the deliberate delay, the interruption of dignity, the demand, unspoken but understood, justify yourself. Prove you belong." Elise looked him in the eyes. "Is there a problem with my documents?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Just a small verification. Routine." But it wasn't routine. And she knew it. The gate agent beside him shifted nervously. Passengers behind her looked on with a mix of curiosity and polite detachment. Because white discomfort is rarely loud, it sits quietly, saying nothing while injustice unfolds right in front of it. Elise stepped to the side, not because she accepted his reasoning, but because she had learned, long ago, that sometimes you must endure the lie in order to reveal the truth. Thomas, for his part, felt his chest tighten. He had done what he told himself was nothing. A small pause, a double check. But in his heart, he knew. He knew it had not been her actions that raised his suspicion. It had been her calm, her confidence, the audacity of her silence. And that is the most dangerous thing in America, a black woman who refuses to shrink. The line moved on. Thomas fumbled with his scanner. Elise stood quietly, phone in hand, noting the time. The supervisor was being called over now. The murmur in the terminal had shifted, curiosity turning to concern. The gate, once a symbol of movement and transition, had become a line in the sand. Between assumption and truth. Between prejudice and procedure. Between a man holding a scanner and a woman holding authority he could not yet see. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Elise Morgan stood near the gate, separated from the line not by ropes, not by law, but by a man's imagination, dressed in uniform. Passengers continued to file in, the boarding gate slowly swallowing the crowd. But more and more eyes were drifting toward her, curious, cautious, confused. Thomas Grayson clutched her boarding pass and ID like they were burning in his hands. He couldn't say why he still held them. Couldn't quite explain what it was he thought he was doing. But deep inside, the story he had told himself, that something was off, that her stillness was cause for concern, was beginning to fray. And what was left? Just him. And her. And the terrible silence between what he feared and what he could not name. The gate agent, Addison, leaned in, voice hushed but urgent. "Thomas, we need to keep the line moving." He ignored her. "Elise Morgan," he repeated to himself under his breath, as if the name alone might reveal a flaw, a deception, a hidden danger. Instead, it revealed the truth. Elise opened her tote bag. From it, she drew a slim black wallet, worn smooth at the edges. She unfolded it slowly. Inside was a federal badge, issued by the Department of Transportation. She held it not like a weapon, but like a mirror. "I'm Dr. Elise Morgan," she said, not loudly, but clearly. "Chief Regulator for the Federal Aviation Administration. I'm here on official travel. And you have no legal reason to delay my boarding." The air shifted. It was not a dramatic moment, not in the way movies promise, but it was seismic all the same. Thomas's face paled. His fingers curled slightly, as if trying to hold onto a reality that was crumbling around him. Passengers in line stopped pretending not to watch. The father with the toddler whispered something to his wife. Addison blinked twice, her face a canvas of alarm. The name, her name, had landed like a gavel. And suddenly everything Thomas thought he knew about the moment, about himself, was gone. He started. Miss. Doctor, I didn't know. You didn't need to know, Elise said, still calm. Because every traveler, regardless of rank, deserves to move through this space without being profiled. She did not spit the word. She did not curse. But it hit like thunder. You pulled me aside for standing still. For not being flustered. For not begging to be seen, she continued. That's not a security protocol. That's biased. And I promise you, I know the difference. Behind them, the supervisor had arrived, a woman named Rosa with silver-threaded braids and the weary gaze of someone who had seen too many of these moments unfold too many times. Elise Morgan? She asked. Yes, Elise replied, flashing the badge again. Rosa's lips tightened. Dr. Morgan, I deeply apologize. Please, board when you're ready. Then her eyes fell on Thomas. Her voice dropped to a whisper meant only for him. Get off the gate. Thomas stood still, swallowing the bitter taste of his own mistake. Because this wasn't just an error. This was exposure. As Elise walked toward the jet bridge, the eyes followed her, not out of suspicion, but out of recognition. Some with respect, some with shame, all with a kind of quiet awe, because power, when it is cloaked in humility, confuses people, especially when it does not come with a shout, but with a name. Especially when it does not ask to be respected, it simply demands not to be diminished. On the jet bridge, Elise paused only once. She looked back, not at the man who had tried to shrink her, but at the space where he had stood. And in that moment, without a word, she rewrote the story. Not for him, but for every silent passenger who had once been told, in so many ways, you don't belong here. You must explain yourself to pass through. That day, she didn't explain. She entered. On her own terms. You cannot humiliate power. You can delay it. Doubt it. Try to ignore it. But once it has revealed itself, once it has spoken in the voice of calm authority, in the presence of ignorance clothed as vigilance, it will not shrink back into silence. Dr. Elise Morgan had boarded the plane without a raised fist. Without a lawsuit. Without an escort. But she carried something heavier than luggage. A name that now echoed through the unseen corridors of accountability. By the time the wheels of the aircraft touched down in Denver, Thomas Grayson's name was already echoing, too, but for reasons quite different. Rosa, the supervisor, had filed a report before the plane left the gate. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Because she knew the truth that many Black folks in positions of compromise understand. If you do not write the story yourself, someone else will write it for you. And it will not be kind. The report outlined the facts. Not the emotions. Not the discomfort. Just the facts. A high-ranking FAA official was held at the gate without cause. The attendant failed to cite a security threat. Bias was suspected. That word, suspected, was enough to open the floodgates. In Atlanta, Delta's operations office opened an inquiry. In Washington, an FAA liaison sent a carefully worded memo to the airline's Government Affairs Department. And in living rooms across America, a blog post began to circulate with a headline too sharp to ignore. Flight attendant attempts to remove FAA regulator while she's traveling for official business. The article didn't mention race in the title. It didn't have to. The photo said it all: Elise, poised and brown-skinned, in a blue blazer. Thomas, mid-sentence, eyes wary, lips drawn. And the people who had lived this scene before, the elders, the veterans, the mothers who had seen their sons patted down for walking while confident, they read between every line. Elise sat in her hotel room in Denver that evening, phone buzzing with messages. A colleague from the Department of Transportation. A quiet ping from a regional newspaper. A text from her niece. Auntie, are you okay? You're trending. Elise sighed, setting the phone face down. She hadn't come for this. She hadn't wanted her name to become another battle cry, another example, another what went wrong. She had wanted only to inspect protocols, improve safety, hold meetings, deliver speeches. But Black women don't always get to choose how they enter history. Sometimes, history comes for them. Meanwhile, in a quiet apartment back in Atlanta, Thomas Grayson sat in front of a computer screen, his name already in bold on a temporary HR document. He didn't read the whole file. He didn't need to. He knew. His hands shook not because he feared being fired, but because he had begun to understand something far more terrifying. He had believed he was doing his job. And that belief, that feeling in his gut, the one he trusted more than facts, more than protocol, more than decency, had just been exposed for what it was. A lie. The kind America teaches, gently and repeatedly. That some people's presence is proof enough of suspicion. That some bodies do not belong until proven otherwise. He thought about her eyes, steady and unbothered. He thought about the badge. He thought about how small he had felt when she spoke, and how he had mistaken that feeling for threat. Somewhere, in the comments beneath the article, an older black veteran wrote, "This isn't new. They used to call it doing your duty back in '63, too." And someone replied, "Yeah, but now they record it." But no one said the thing that mattered most. That dignity isn't granted. It's carried. And that Thomas had tried to deny Elise Morgan wasn't access to the plane. It was her right to move through the world without shrinking. The calls would continue. The headlines would spin. The policies would be reviewed. But in that quiet room, Elise sat, unmoved by the noise. She'd seen America shift before. Just enough to look like change. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was watching. Because the fall of one flight attendant doesn't signal the fall of the system that created him. And dignity, once disrespected, demands not just apology, but reckoning. There is a silence that follows disgrace. It is not the absence of noise, it is the presence of truth. And for Thomas Grayson, that silence came not in the hearing room, not in the office where HR handed him a notice, but in his own apartment, where the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound brave enough to linger. He sat alone, still in uniform. Not because he had anywhere to go, but because taking it off would mean confronting what he'd done in it. He had watched the story unfold from his phone, watching strangers say his name with disgust, with certainty, with the kind of moral clarity that the guilty fear most. He read words like profiling, abuse of power, racial bias. He saw screenshots of the moment, her badge, his hand mid-gesture. He scrolled through 1,000 voices. Some defended him. He was just doing his job. Others condemned him. This is what Black travelers go through every day. But the voice that stayed with him was hers. That's not protocol. That's biased. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She had simply named what he'd spent his entire adult life pretending wasn't there. At the review meeting the next day, he sat across from a woman named Caroline, Delta's internal affairs manager. She had seen dozens like him. Not evil men. Just tired men. Blind men. Men who carried authority like a shield and fear like a compass. She didn't smile. "Mr. Grayson," she began, "your record has been clean, until now." He nodded. The kind of nod that admits more than it explains. She placed her fingers together. "Tell me why you singled her out." He looked at his lap. I don't know," he said. "She just seemed different." "Different," she repeated, her voice flat. He shifted. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But she was just standing there. Calm. Too calm. Like she was watching us. Caroline let the words sit. "You thought that was suspicious?" He swallowed. "I thought maybe she was assessing us. Maybe planning to report something." She leaned forward. "So you saw a Black woman standing in line, composed. Not angry. Not loud. And your instinct was to remove her." He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Because there, in that quiet room, the truth had finally stood up. And he wasn't ready for it. Caroline didn't yell. She didn't scold. She simply said, "You may not be a racist, but that doesn't mean your actions weren't racist." Then she slid a folder across the table. Unpaid suspension. For weeks. Mandatory bias training. final warning. He signed without protest. Because he knew, not just that he'd been wrong, but that he'd been wrong loudly and publicly, and at the expense of someone who had done nothing but carry herself with pride. And that pride had frightened him. Not because it was violent, but because it was immune to shame. Meanwhile, Elise Morgan returned to Washington. Her schedule resumed. Meetings, policy reviews, late nights, early flights. But something had shifted. She now knew, intimately, what her data reports could never capture. The tension in the eyes of staff who had read the news. The deferential tone from airline executives eager to avoid missteps. The sideways glances from travelers who weren't sure whether to smile or say nothing at all. She had become a symbol. And symbols, no matter how dignified, are heavy to carry. Still, she did not waver. Because she knew what it meant to survive that moment with grace. What it meant for every Black woman in every airport who would never hold an FAA badge. Who would be delayed, interrogated, ignored, and have no name strong enough to stop the scanner. One night, a letter arrived. It was from Thomas. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. Just an apology. Clumsy. Humans. Ashamed. He wrote, "I thought I was keeping people safe. But the truth is, I only saw safety when I saw people who looked like me. And that is not safe at all." She read it twice. Then she placed it in a drawer, not to forget, but to remember. Because growth, when it comes, does not erase the wound. It simply means someone, somewhere, might not have to bleed the same way. There comes a moment in every country's reckoning when the stage is set. The actors are summoned, and the curtain rises not for a performance, but for a trial of the nation's conscience. This hearing, called to investigate a flight attendant's conduct, was never just about boarding passes or gate protocol. It was about power. It was about the weight of uniforms and the lightness of certain people's grievances when held up against the gravity of others' lived experience. It was about what we choose to excuse and whom we are too afraid to hold accountable. The room itself was gray and sterile. No drama, no pomp. Just government-issue carpeting, a pitcher of water, and chairs that had heard too many apologies. Dr. Elise Morgan sat calmly at the front, not as the accused, not even as a plaintiff, but as a witness. To what had happened. To what keeps happening. To the quiet, daily rituals of racial humiliation, made all the more dangerous when they wear the mask of professionalism. Behind her, an audience gathered. Airline reps, FAA executives. Reporters are too polite to record openly, but scribbling is just the same. And in the far corner, his shoulders hunched in a navy blazer that suddenly looked too big for him, sat Thomas Grayson. He looked smaller than she remembered. And that, too, was familiar. Because racism, when confronted, always folds itself into something softer. It becomes a misunderstanding. It becomes unconscious bias. It becomes not who I am. But never, never does it name itself. The chairwoman called the hearing to order. Dr. Morgan, we appreciate your presence here today. Please describe the incident in your own words. Elise didn't look at Thomas when she spoke. Her voice was steady. Not angry. Not trembling. I was pulled from the boarding line without cause. Asked to show my ID twice. Then I was told I may need to wait for another flight, despite having a confirmed seat and proper documentation. She paused. I asked why. I was told something felt off. That I seemed too calm. That I might be a threat. Another pause. I then revealed my identity as Chief Regulator of the Federal Aviation Administration. The room stirred. And in that quiet disruption lay the oldest wound of all. Because in America, what shocks us is never the act of injustice. What shocks us is who it happens to. The chairwoman cleared her throat. And what would you say was the underlying cause of Mr. Grayson's actions? Elise didn't blink. Assumption, she said. Fueled by race. Unspoken, but deeply felt. A man in a dark suit shifted in his seat. Someone dropped a pen. Thomas lowered his head. And in that moment, the story that had been whispered behind closed doors, argued over in comment sections, parsed in newsrooms, was now etched in the public record. Not as spectacle, but as fact. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, his voice trembled. "I thought I was protecting the flight," he said. "I misjudged. I acted on instinct. I didn't recognize her." The room held its breath. He didn't mean her face. He meant her worth. After the testimonies, there were questions. A panelist asked Elise about airline training protocols. Another asked about how often these incidents occur. She answered with grace. With data. With the restraint that Black women in leadership wear like skin. And then one woman, an elder from the Civil Aviation Board, white-haired, soft-spoken, looked up from her notes. "Dr. Morgan," she asked quietly, "what do you hope comes of all this?" Elise took a breath. "I don't want him fired," she said. "I want him educated. I want policies reviewed. I want staff to be trained to see passengers, not profiles. And above all, I want the next Black woman who stands in line to be seen as just another traveler. Not a suspect." There it was. Not vengeance. Not punishment. Just the stubborn, unshakable demand for humanity. The kind that gets denied at every checkpoint. As the hearing closed, Thomas rose, hesitated, then approached her. He offered no defense. No plea. Only this. "I'm sorry." She looked at him, not with anger, but with history. "Next time," she said, "see me the first time." And with that, she turned and walked out. Back into a world where she would still be questioned, still be doubted, but never again would she be unseen. Justice is not always the thunderclap. Sometimes it is the paper memo, folded and passed quietly from one desk to another. Sometimes it is the training manual rewritten by hands that once looked the other way. And sometimes it is a man, shaken, no longer sure of his own place, forced to stand in the ruins of what he once called instinct. It was 2 weeks after the hearing. The decision came not in a blaze of headlines, but in a curt email to Thomas Grayson from Delta's corporate office. 4-week unpaid suspension. Mandatory anti-bias recertification. Placement under observation for 6 months. One more incident. Termination. No courtroom. No applause. Just consequence. The kind that lingers in a man's skin. The kind that makes him wonder whether the badge on his chest had ever really meant he was seeing clearly or simply being seen as legitimate. Meanwhile, Dr. Elise Morgan returned to her work. But she was not the same. Something had shifted, not in her title, not in her resume, but in her presence. The way people greeted her in hallways. The way junior agents stopped her after meetings to whisper, "Thank you for what you said." She had not planned to become a symbol. But symbols, like burdens, are rarely chosen. She kept going. Through inspections. Through briefings. Through long flights and short layovers where gate agents now double-checked themselves when she handed them a ticket. They recognized her now. But not all for the right reasons. And the public? Oh, the public did what it always does. Some called her brave. Others said she was overreacting. A few claimed she had used her position to humiliate a working man. But those who knew, those who had lived long enough to understand the quiet humiliations of American travel while Black, they saw something else. They saw a woman who had taken a common injury and made it undeniable. They saw a moment where power finally had to answer for its presumption. And that mattered. Even if it didn't fix everything. In a quiet part of Atlanta, Thomas Grayson sat through his first training session. It wasn't dramatic. Just a projector. A voice on tape. A Black woman on screen explaining what it means to be read as dangerous while standing still. He felt something tighten in his chest. And for the first time, he didn't defend it. Didn't interrupt. Didn't retreat behind the curtain of policy. He just listened. Because now he knew. He knew how a glance could become a gate. How a gut feeling could become a wall. And how one decision, made in silence, could echo all the way to Washington. That fall, Delta quietly updated its internal policies. Mandatory quarterly equity reviews, anonymous bias reporting tools, a revised definition of suspicious behavior. It didn't make the news, but Elise noticed. So did Rosa, the gate supervisor. So did Addison, the gate agent who had said nothing that day but had felt everything. The change was slow, but it was real. Because that's what change looks like in a country like ours. It doesn't arrive in speeches. It lives in the decision not to pull someone aside just because they're too calm, too proud, too black. Elise Morgan sat one night in her DC apartment, the city buzzing faintly beyond her window. She poured herself a glass of tea, opened a book, then paused. Her phone lit up. A text. Unknown number. It read, "Thank you. You don't know me, but what you did helped more than just yourself." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because some stories don't end. They ripple. From the terminal, to the office, to the seat beside you on the next flight. This is what justice looks like in America. Not perfect. Not fast. But when it comes, it demands that we remember. That we do not go quiet again. That we do not let uniforms decide who belongs. That we do not mistake the calmness of a black woman for threat ever again. And above all, that we keep walking forward, even if the world still makes us take the long way around. Because the gate is still there. But so are we.